am reading this, that Rachel Reeves has said in her defence in response to a question. She was asked by a Times journalist, does she think Britain can learn from Donald Trump, whose unashamed boosterism appears to be paying dividends in the United States? She replies, yes, I think we need more positivity and to be more optimistic if the nation is to revive animal spirits and turn around the economy. I don't know what she means. And I've really thought about it since reading this statement. I'm just not sure what animal spirits in relation to the economy is supposed to evoke. And I also don't know, I think I understand nationalism in relation to Donald Trump, and that I suppose could be reframed as positivity about one's country. But I don't know how that derives economic benefit directly. So I need you to call me and explain it to me. What do you think she means? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can also text on 84850, or you can send a comment to LBC via your Alexa. Well, we're joined now by Laurie Laird, who is a US political commentator. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can I ask, first of all, how would we define positivity in relation to Donald Trump? What do we think that Rachel Reeves is referencing there?
Presumably she is referencing that everything is bigger and better and more successful in America as long as you do what Donald Trump says. This may not be all that controversial, but I would argue that Donald Trump's boosterism may be a little bit misplaced. What he has outlined in terms of economic policy is by no means a guarantee to make the U.S. economy grow more quickly. He inherited a pretty healthy economy from Joe Biden. And I think Joe Biden and his economic team may not have got sufficient credit for that. But what Donald Trump is proposing it doesn't give many economists ground for optimism. I mean, the most salient economic feature that he's discussed are these tariffs. Now, he didn't announce any tariffs on day one, and I think that people breathed a sigh of relief, but that doesn't mean he calls himself tariff man. I think we have to assume that some tariffs are coming down the road. Donald Trump has done something remarkable, and that's he's managed to convince Americans that tariffs, which ultimately are inflationary, are somehow in their interest. Tariffs aren't paid by foreign companies. They're paid by companies in the U.S. that may import goods or services that then they sell on to American consumers. If you look at, say, a car company that is going to import steel, once there's a tariff, once that steel becomes more expensive because of a tariff, it's the car company in the U.S. that is paying that tariff. It's not a faceless, nameless foreign company. And in fact, often those tariffs are taken out of that company's bank account and they go straight to the Treasury. Companies then tend to pass on that higher cost to consumers. So tariffs, there's a great body of economic evidence that suggests that tariffs are inflationary, yet Donald Trump managed to convince voters that putting tariffs on goods is in their interest. It's quite remarkable.
I wonder whether, I'll never forget, I had a call to this show once where somebody was saying that in saying "Make America Great Again," what Donald Trump was actually doing was giving the electorate confidence and giving the country confidence. And we know that one of the challenges of this current Labour government is to make people feel richer by the end of their term, whether or not they objectively are, as we saw with Joe Biden and all the improvements he made to the economy that apparently weren't being felt by the people, whether or not they are actually richer seems to be immaterial as compared to whether or not they feel richer. So do you think that that's perhaps what she's referencing?
You've hit on something that's so very interesting, because when we look at economic data, we look at aggregates. So we can look at the U.S. economy growing by an annualized rate of 2 and a bit %. Earlier this year, the UK economy, actually the first 6 months of the year, the UK economy was growing almost as quickly as that. Yet that's an aggregate. That doesn't mean that everybody in the economy is feeling the same thing. Some areas are growing much more quickly than others. But in both countries, we have a situation where even though inflation has come close to where central banks target, and that's an annual rate of about 2%. And we're not there yet, but we're a lot closer to that 2% target than we were a few years ago. Remember, inflation spiked to 11% here in the UK, over 9% in the US. Inflation coming down means that prices are still rising. They're just rising at a slower pace. And if you look at the average price of a basket of goods, again, both in the US and the UK, that's roughly 20% more expensive now than it was pre-pandemic. And people feel that, even if we're hearing that inflation is under control. And I think that's one of the biggest things that got Donald Trump elected. People felt like they were paying more for things. And in the US, there's the metric for inflation that most Americans use is petrol prices. It's a real in-your-face reminder of where prices are. When you're driving in your car, you will see petrol prices posted all over the place. Petrol prices are really emotive in America. And I think that translated into votes for Donald Trump. And by the way, petrol prices in the US are about half what they are here in the UK because they're incredibly lightly taxed.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. That was Laurie Laird, a US political commentator. Coming back now to this side of the pond, very pleased to be joined by Zoë Grünewald, who is, of course, a political journalist and who was listening to that exchange. Zoë, what do you make of this? And I'm talking about strategy here. Do you think that Rachel Reeves is trying to evoke Trumpism as a deliberate strategy, or do you think that it was just a misspeak in relation to a question that she was asked by a journalist?
Yeah, I think this is a slight misinterpretation or misspeak, as you say, or misreporting even of what particularly happened here. So in an interview with The Times, she was asked, do you think Britain can learn from Donald Trump and his boosterism? And she said, yes, I think we do need more positivity. I've challenged businesses as well and said no one is going to speak up for Britain apart from us. I think what's going on here is Labour is very... they're overcorrecting slightly from a messy start to their communication, so that we know when Labour came into office, they said very, very clearly, the country's a mess, we've got pain coming, things are going to get worse before they get better, which is a terrible message to tell an electorate that's had a really terrible 14 years of declining living standards, rising costs, stagnant wages, ruined public services, who have then lent their trust to you, voted you back in after 14 years in the wilderness, to then tell them actually things are going to still be very bad for a while because we're not prepared to do something radical. We're going to tinker around the edges, essentially. That's the sort of thing that really disappointed voters. And I think it got Labour off to a sticky start. So I think what they're trying to do now is they're trying to correct that and actually talk about Britain as a place which is on the up. It's something we should be excited about. We are going to get more investment in. We're going to put spades in the ground and build more. We're going to return our public services around. We're going to get people back into work. And I think one of the reasons they had to do that as well, because when they started speaking about future turmoil in the economy, that actually did cause some lack of confidence from investors in the market. And that was looking like it could hamper Rachel Reeves' growth plans. So I think what they're trying to do now is change their tone. The problem is it is really important how you kick off your government, what kind of message you send and what kind of confidence you're inspiring from business. So they're going to have to do lots and lots of positive noises to produce that kind of slightly Trumpian approach to, our country is great, I'm going to make it great again, and I'm going to put America, or in this case, the UK first.
I wonder, you've said that it was a misspeak in response to a question, but I have heard David Lammy and others speaking in much more glowing, positive terms about Donald Trump. What do you make of that as a strategy? Do you think that that's wise, considering how relatively unpopular Donald Trump is here in the UK?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've seen a real shift in tone from the Labour government, key figures in the Labour government who have previously been pretty disparaging of Trump. And there are some kind of understandable reasons for this, as in once you're in government, everybody knows you have to play diplomacy, much more than you can when you're in opposition. So that is one part of it. But I think you're absolutely right that particularly David Lammy, who has been very, very strong, he's been a real progressive voice in Labour, to now, as Foreign Secretary, have to do a lot of that diplomacy, have to really swallow perhaps his true feelings about Donald Trump, it can't help but come across slightly disingenuous. And I think also there is a real worry that if the Labour government goes to Donald Trump and their approach is to really, massage his ego and tell him what he wants to hear and talk very, very positively about him, will that be interpreted as weakness by Trump? And therefore, will he actually try and bully the UK? Is it better to go to someone like Donald Trump, who is a businessman, who respects strength in that sense, and actually stand up to him? And then, of course, there is the moral question. There are some things that Trump is doing, has spoken about, that would be objectionable to us here in the UK. So if the UK wants to be a world leader, and one of the things Keir Starmer made very clear in his general election campaign was that he is Mr. Rules. He is a former human rights lawyer. He wants to be, squeaky clean. Then he needs to be, he needs to have that integrity when he's dealing with Donald Trump. It's a difficult balance to have when you're in governance, when we don't have that relationship with Europe, when we, are slightly hostage to some of the US's policies. But equally, I think it really will test Labour's resolve and integrity. And I would say someone like Donald Trump does need standing up to. And I think there's going to be a real push and pull and lots of disquiet in Labour and amongst Labour supporters about how they deal with Donald Trump, because I suspect we're only at the beginning of what is going to be a very tumultuous and morally testing few years.
How optimistic are you about the next 4 years or almost 4 years of Labour government?
It's a good question. I mean, there are good things in the pipeline, and there are things that I think have been overshadowed by some of the media coverage. So, for example, the Renters Reform Bill finishing its passage through the House of Commons, going into the House of Lords. That's something that can make a real tangible difference to lots of people's rights when it comes to living in rented accommodation. Abolishing no-fault evictions will really be life-changing for a lot of people. That's a good success and something we should celebrate. Planning reform, if Labour can get it through, that could also have a huge impact on our economy. But there are still lots of questions about whether it's enough. And as you spoke about earlier and your guest spoke about earlier, even though the economy improved in the US, we still saw voters unhappy if their living standards didn't increase. And we have, the rise of the far right. We have a Labour government that seems to want to attack the far right by talking their language rather than trying to actually come up with solutions such as safe and legal routes, for example, when it comes to immigration. And I think there is a real worry that Labour is either going to be too cautious or they are going to kind of, step around things rather than face them head on. And we have a very impatient electorate who have had, 15 years of difficulty. So I am optimistic about some of the things, but I hope Labour will be stronger and slightly more radical as they build up confidence and as they get that experience of governance.